Chapter 13 Midoro Swamp. As awkward and nerve-wracking as it had been to share the bed with Sing while he finished recovering, Link found himself wishing to be back in that room soon after sunrise when they left Saria Town. The good news was that thanks to the magician's powers, the Lord Sheriff was back to full strength, but it was still raining pretty hard when they left the inn, leaving both of them soaked even before the horse reached the village limits. North, past the grasslands, which was already becoming waterlogged, and then onward into the marshes, while the morning sun moved up behind the heavy gray clouds. Link didn't say very much during the ride, still feeling uneasy because of how they had spent the night. And even now, as they rode toward Midoro Swamp, the dark-haired woman's arms were around him, while she had her body pressed against his back. The way Sing acted towards him. The Lord Sheriff wasn't sure if she was just toying with him, or if she actually liked him, or... Man, it was so frustrating to have an enemy like this. She was so beautiful, and Link had slept better than he had in years while holding her. But she was also the one who cursed Princess Zelda in the first place, and who even knew how many others she had led to their deaths on this exact same quest. "I would stop the horse here if I were you," Sing said as the water started to get higher. "You'll have to go on foot from now on." He stopped the horse, like she said, but the magician surprised him when she didn't follow after he jumped down. Apparently, this challenge was one that Link had to complete on his own, and although she wouldn't give him any real details, the dark-haired woman instructed him to walk through the swamp until he reached the old entrance to the cisterns. He was familiar with such places. The southern outskirts had tunnels that ran underground to prevent flooding during storms, but those old drains had been full of man-eating Zoras. "As I said before, you will need more than brute strength for this," the magician continued, looking off toward the swamp. "Be careful, Link. Only a handful of those chosen for the quest have managed to succeed here." Well, that was just great, Link thought, as he turned around to face the swamp, but somehow it gave him comfort when the dark-haired woman added that she would be waiting for him when he succeeded. This comfort was added by another of those warm, genuine smiles of hers, but topped with confusion when he remembered that his quest was to wake Princess Zelda. He just knew that he and the original princess were meant to be together, regardless of what the magician said, and with that, he started into the swamp. Within 3 steps beyond the marshes, the water was up past his ankles, and in another 5 steps, the water was up to his knees, but thankfully this was as high as it decided to go. A flash of lightning cut across the sky above, followed by crashing thunder and a sudden gust of wind as the rain started coming down harder, making the Lord Sheriff briefly consider exactly what the hell he was doing there. This place was miserable. This whole quest was miserable. And who was to say that he would be able to succeed where so many others had failed? At least wondering about this made the walk across the swamp seem shorter, and it was actually a good thing that it was raining, since the falling water tended to scare off the larger insects and predatory creatures of the marshlands, which made no sense to him, since such creatures spent their whole lives in some kind of water. Oh well. It was hard enough to trudge through the mud and knee-high water without having to stop and kill something every 10 seconds, so he decided not to worry about it. Eventually, the building that Sing had described, in fact the only building in the entire swamp, came into view. A small stone structure that was mostly overgrown with vines and algae that would have probably sunk into the swamp if not for the maze of tunnels that ran below it. The whole place was dark and foreboding, actually making Link wish that he was still at the dry and brightly lit Parappa Palace ruins, especially when he got close enough to see down into the entrance. Beyond the doorless opening was a stone staircase that had a constant stream of water running down its stone surface, but beyond that, there was no light at all. There were no lanterns, no old candles, not even any wall-mounted torches that could be dried out and reused. And yet the Lord Sheriff could see down to the bottom of the stairs somehow. Well, no one said that the challenge was going to be easy, so after taking a deep breath, Link took the first echoing step through the entrance. Splash, glong, splash, glong. His footsteps producing noise that made being stealthy impossible as he moved down the stairs, the Lord Sheriff eventually reached the bottom, where the cold water was still ankle-deep, and yes, he could still see. Apparently, there were small openings in the top of the rounded tunnels that branched away from the stairs, and although they were obviously for letting more water drain in, they also let in a small amount of sunlight. Each hole was small, but there were a lot of them, so even with the sun being blocked by clouds, there was enough light to at least let him see the tunnels and their features. Of course, now that Link was down inside the storm drains, where in the hell was he supposed to go? There were several different tunnels to choose from, and they all looked the same, but on the other hand, if some of the other chosen ones had figured out where to go, then there had to be some kind of difference. He looked around at the walls, ceilings, and floors of each tunnel one at a time, but there was nothing to distinguish the first tunnel from the second one. Or the third one. Or the fourth. Wait a second, the back of his hand was starting to hurt again, just as it had done at the ruins of Parappa Palace. The mark on his hand was glowing just a bit when he was examining the fourth tunnel, only to stop when he moved past it. Well, that was easier than I thought, Link said, seeing it glow again when he moved back to the fourth tunnel. Number 4 it is, then. Sloshing his way down the tunnel, while trying to avoid the water that was dripping down onto him through the holes, the Lord Sheriff was trying to make as little noise as possible so that he could listen for any approaching threats. Not that the constantly flowing and splashing water was making this easy. The good news was that anything coming after him was going to have to come from either directly in front or behind, since there were no side passages in the tunnel. But the bad news was that the floor was suddenly missing when he took his next step. Whoosh! After falling forward and hitting the ground again, Link realized that the floor had not disappeared, but instead became a steep downward slope when he wasn't paying attention, and now he was sliding down head first into the unknown. The Lord Sheriff wasn't sure how far down he had gone, since the speed of the rushing water made it hard to judge distances, but when the ride finally stopped, it ended with a splash into water that was a lot deeper than his ankles. In fact, he had to get to his feet, fighting to stand up in the now waist-deep water, and discovered that he was now inside of a large open chamber. The ceiling was much higher, but there were still multiple small holes with water and light coming through, dimly illuminating the area, at least enough for him to see that he couldn't get back up the way he had come. There also didn't seem to be any other passages leading out of the chamber, but that was impossible because the water was still flowing. Okay, how does the water get out? He whispered to himself, looking around. How does... It does not, a whispering voice echoed in the darkness. Nothing gets out of here. The echoing was so bad within the chamber that it was impossible to tell where the voice had come from, but then it was gone. Now that the area was more open and the water was deeper, the Lord Sheriff drew his silver sword, trying to stay still and listen for movements as he looked around. Nothing in the air or on the walls that he could see, nor was the water rippling aside from near the drains or when he moved himself. So where had the voice come from, and more importantly, where had it gone? Hopeless, the same voice whispered again. Doomed. Doomed from the start. A flash of light from behind. Orange light that caused Link to duck down, and a strange object flew overhead. And while at first he thought that it was a fireball, like the kind that Aghanim was so fond of, when it slowed down and circled back toward him before hitting the wall, he realized it was not a fireball. This thing was a perfect glowing sphere, big as a watermelon, flashing between orange and maybe blue, with something at the center. Something that almost looked like a skull? Ducking down again as a second object flew over his head, and then another, and another. From out of nowhere, there were now more than a dozen of those glowing skull objects flying around the room, forming a kind of snaking circle that illuminated the whole chamber for several seconds, each of them whispering a similar warning about doom and no one getting out of here and whatnot, before suddenly splitting apart and crashing into the water at different points around the chamber. A kind of rumbling was both heard and felt as the whole chamber started to shake, and then something else appeared. It was strange, a kind of viney thing like tendrils of a spreading plant, several of them appearing, one at each point where one of the glowing skull objects had crashed into the water, and growing up the wall a short distance. But there was something else, too. Tangled within each of the viney plants was a skeleton, wrapped up as if restrained in a net or web of some kind. "Your quest leads to nothing but death," one of the skeletons whispered. "Run. Flee while you still can." "There is no hope," another of them added. "This quest is a trap that leads here." "Run. Run for your life," a third warned. "Forget the princess. Forget Hyrule. We all failed, and you will too." Now their words were starting to bother him, as did this whole scene playing out before him in general. But what they were saying, were these all that was left of the chosen ones who failed in this place? There was no time for thinking about it, though, as the water at the center of the chamber started to churn, and with it, a figure started to rise up. A figure that was wearing old, vine-covered armor, and holding a rusty sword.